Joe.
Well, thanks, folks. It's really an honor to participate with you today. I'm so proud of the mentoring program and all the work that you all have done to create this, and also of folks who had done previous versions of it. And it's a lot of work, I know. It takes a lot of coordination. So thank you. And it's really an honor to have a chance to share some reflections with you today. I'm just going to look at the time to make sure I don't talk too long myself. So the first question had to do with what are your Native leadership traditions? I'm an enrolled member of the Gros tribe of the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, and I come from, on my dad's side, the Azure and Brisboe families, which is a Little Shell family name, and a Nakota Assiniboine family name. And on my mom's side, from the Gon and the Crazy families, which are both Ani Gros. And so I want to talk to you today in terms of my leadership traditions as really anchoring them within Ani Gros life. Because as you can imagine, with so many different traditions and ancestries, there's a lot of ways that you could try to make sense of different strands of tradition coming together through each of our ancestries. The historical context for what we really have know a lot about pre-reservation Gros leadership tradition is one in which on the Northern Plains there was great violence. This had to do with traders and trappers and the hide trade in general, which was further imbalanced by guns coming in from one direction and horses coming in from the other. So that led to a cauldron of violence as Europeans were really looking to have good trading partners, and Indians wanted to control that trade for desired goods. And it was during this period really that our people organized into hunting bands essentially, and where bands had chiefs. And the thing to know about chiefs and bands are that there's a great deal of autonomy by individuals at any time. Very rare in that kind of loose as opposed to tight social organization for people to do what they wanted. So you might follow one particular leader or one particular band and then decide that you want to follow another one. And so you just pick up and go join that band. It is important probably to be part of a band at that particular time because of the violence and the dangers of warfare, and also because you don't want to be on your own if catastrophe of some other sort follows. But a great deal of personal autonomy, which means that leadership was fundamentally about upholding, maintaining, and respecting personal autonomy of individuals. And I think that fits in with some of what you've heard from some of our other leaders they talked today about the importance of kind of leading by example, indirection, not really telling or ordering or commanding people what to do. It's much more loose than that. How did one become a chief of these bands? Well, two things. First of all, you had mostly to be male. So it was gendered in important ways that's relevant to acknowledge, and which raises the question of how much continuity do we want to find with some of these traditions in modern circumstances? All of us are always about, I think, trying to find connections to our historical traditions and recasting them in ways that make sense for the modern world. And as I talk about in a minute, I think today leadership is more diverse gender than it used to be in our community, at least. The other thing is that it had to do with rank. And Gros people were one of 5 indigenous groups in North America who were age graded, which is to say that men moved through a sequence of age hierarchy marked by ceremony and joining societies over the course of their entire lifespan, beginning in late adolescence. And so this importance of rank and standing that goes with rank, and especially status coming with age among men, structured our entire society, and indeed reflected a broader hierarchy of rank within the cosmos. So human beings are sort of the lowest of beings in the cosmos, but above us, there are other beings ascending all the way up through a whole rank hierarchy of beings, including ultimately the one above or the supreme being, but lots of other beings in between. You know, a lot of our prayers and rituals involved acknowledging, 8 or 10 of these other beings in rank order for their power and potency. And so in that sense, because standing and status accorded with rank and that accorded with age, it meant that there was a lot of power and authority with being older and with being male in public spheres. And I think female also more so in intimate or private spheres, family spheres, domestic spheres. I think the operating principle I would use to describe how these things played out as well is one of constructive competition. That is, Grovant men in particular who aspired to rank were extremely ambitious, typically, and looked to accord honors and have a great career throughout their lives by doing a couple of important things during this pre-reservation era. The first was to go to war, because it was a period of violence and where tribal survival depended on protecting territory and having an advantage in terms of things like guns and horses, and raiding, to go steal horses, because the horse was everything when you lived on the northern plains, starting in the early 1700s all the way through the reservation era. And so a person actually could not become a leader unless they had resources to generously distribute to followers. And indeed, that's how followers decided to fall in behind certain leaders, is if they could count on those leaders to redistribute property, goods, lend a horse, whatever would be necessary to enable the needs to be met and for one to arise. So I know it's pretty commonplace, particularly in Indian psychology literature, to suggest that Indians don't like competition, that rather we're cooperative. But I think that's really not the case for our people in the pre-reservation era. Even as I wonder if it's the case for any peoples who were at war, Plains peoples more generally, in the way that that is dichotomized. Of course, we were cooperative too. So I'm not saying it was only competitive, not cooperative, but to say that we're not competitive does not fit with what I have been taught about our traditions. But the important thing is that competition was grounded in a constructive way that was for the benefit of everyone in some way, shape, or form. And that's why you could not become a leader without honors without war honors, without property, and without generosity. The worst thing you could be is stingy. So sharing food, sharing access to horses or what have you was the way that someone became a leader. What is my leadership style? Well, talk about that, I'll tell you a bit of a story, which is when I was a young man, I enlisted in the United States Army, and I went and served in the 2nd Cavalry over in what was then West Germany to help patrol the Iron Curtain at that time. So my experience in leadership development really came through the military, and subsequent to my enlistment overseas, I became a cadet, which means that I was training to be an officer. So I had very overt, direct leadership training in preparation for being an officer in the Army. But it wasn't that long thereafter where I left the Army. I came to be a student, and during my student years, I was home on the reservation, and I'm learning more about leadership there. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, I spent a semester at home. The goal was to teach in our tribal college. And I hadn't taught more than a few weeks before my tribal council members came to me and asked me to be the tribal administrator or the chief administrative officer for the tribe. And so I thought about that and decided to take it on. And that was an immensely valuable experience in terms of thinking and learning about leadership, in part because I recognized a really huge mismatch between some things that are set up on our reservation, at least, and how leadership might be enacted. The main issue, I would say, was that I inherited a bureaucracy of 50 programs and 200 staff, and yet no one person could tell me what were the 50 programs and who were the 200 staff associated with all of them. In other words, it was not a very well-oiled bureaucracy. And so I took as my goal the opportunity to try streamline that bureaucracy. And I did go about that. In fact, I found out recently when I was in our tribal chambers, I guess it was last year, that the policies and procedures I wrote for our tribal bureaucracy are still in observation 25 years later. But that was a contribution, I suppose. And yet what I most learned was that no matter how well-oiled a bureaucracy could be, and I actually don't think it can be very well-oiled in many respects, it is really a mismatch for these older traditions of leadership in which people are looking for leaders for support and resources when they need them. So I remember, for example, tribal members coming into the tribal offices, and they wanted, $300 from the tribe to go, gas money to go visit a relative who was sick or go to a funeral somewhere. And of course, in terms of like federal program dollars, we didn't have money to give to people. Often funerals we could make do, but there were other aspects that wasn't rising quite to that. And so they would come to me as the tribal administrator, and I said, well, I'd like to help you out, but we don't really have a pot of money like that. And I'm trying to think of what programs would allow that kind of payment. So, okay, thanks a lot. They'd leave, and then I'd see them go down the hall to the next office, and they'd go talk to someone in that program there, and I assumed they were asking the same question. And then I'd see them leave and go downstairs to a different program. By the end of the day, they had a check for their $300 to go do what they needed to do. Now, where did it come from, and how was it authorized, and how? I have no idea. But what I do know is that how leadership was operating was that tribal members needed resources. They came to the source of tribal resources, which was the tribal building with all the programs and dollars, and they would make the rounds until they found someone who could give them the resources they needed. That, in my view, is a persistence of that older kind of leadership. It's about following people who have resources to share with you. And it is not conducive to building a well-oiled bureaucracy that is accountable for federal dollars on paper with the kinds of things. Since then, of course, I've become an academic, and I've been working in academia now for 20 years. And academia is interesting because it is operates, at least in my corner of academia, using soft power. I've been told maybe only a handful of times in my entire career, you must do this. It's never that way. And yet, people exert influence all the time. It's just done in a way that is more about reputation and what people think of you and how they talk about you and how resources end up being allocated in ways that are often behind closed doors or a little bit mysterious. In terms of my life in academia, leadership seems to require more than what military would offer in terms of commands and orders by those who literally wear their rank on their sleeve. And it's different even than a tribal bureaucracy, which was conflicted in that. I really learned at the University of Illinois as a graduate student where I got my doctorate in fighting Chief Alinowick, who was a mascot that we were trying to get the university to retire, a particular approach to leadership that was about soft power. And it was really about creating conditions for different people to come together and contribute their energy and their engagement to try to get a common goal achieved. It was like the best experience I've had in my life, even though it was against the mascot, which was ridiculous and very frustrating to try work at a university institution to get something that should have been straightforward to change eliminated. But in terms of how we came together and the work that we did together was quite amazing. So 3, how do you aspire to lead? How do you know it's effective? I really do think about 4 conditions that I think of around how I aspire to lead. 1, based on that kind of anti-mascot coalition we created in Illinois and the soft power of academia. It's about creating conditions for people to contribute their energy and engagement to get something changed. It's about helping to set priorities because there's 20, 30, 50 things that we could be doing, say at SIP. And yet how do we, among those 50 things, pick out the 2 or the 3 or the 4 that most and urgently need our attention now to make a difference? 3rd is about contributing resources. How can we get more to be able to do more when we're on such a shoestring as it is, and there's just not enough people and funds to help get everything done we might like to. And then how do we then harness energy and talent of all of our capable volunteers and people who are eager to make a contribution of their own? How do we coordinate that and allow for that people to thrive in contributing those kinds of things for their benefit? So when I think about future leadership, at least insofar as SIP is concerned, I tend to think about like very basic SIP operations. I've been involved in SIP for 25 years. And we can't tell you today definitively who our members are and who our members are not. We cannot tell you today definitively who has paid their dues and who has not paid their dues. We cannot tell you that we can run an election in which everyone who is entitled to vote is actually eligible and able to vote through a means that we can offer. So there's a sense in which there are some very basic things about an organization that have never really been ironed out. And in my mind, in terms of the setting priorities sorts of thing, that's what I have in mind as I think about ascending to the presidency in the next couple of years. That's what I have to say today. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much.